Locke on the Origin and Purpose of Government, Lecture 1. In the previous lectures on Locke, we talked about some of Locke's basic concepts, his understanding of the state of nature, the law of nature, the right to life, the right to liberty, natural equality, and the right to property being the most prominent things. And so everything we've covered so far really concerns the rights and duties that human beings have by nature, that is prior to or outside of political society. With the readings we're talking about now, chapters 7 and thereafter, we get into Locke's political philosophy proper, where he talks about government, where it comes from, what its powers are, and things like that. Now, I just want to mention two other things from the earlier chapters before we move on to talking about the origin and purpose of government. The first one, which I skipped over before, is that Locke argues that by nature, we're all subject to the law of nature, but one of the rights or one of the liberties that we have by nature is that we have the right to enforce the law of nature, meaning that we have the right as individuals to punish those that we believe have broken the law of nature in their treatment either of ourselves or of others. So if we see somebody harm another in their life, liberty, or property, we have a right to intervene in order to set things right. Or if somebody harms us in our liberty or our property or tries to take our lives, we have a right to punish them for that. Now, where punishment, by punishment, he means inflict some kind of harm. Now, Locke argues that punishment has to be proportionate to the offense. So you don't have the right to just kill people if they give you a bad look, right? Or if somebody like steals a fish from you, you don't have the right to kill them. So punishment has to be proportionate. But the basic two motivations for punishment or purposes of punishment are to aim at restraint. It is to say you punish somebody in order to prevent them from doing that again, or to kind of set an example of them so that other people don't do it, right? It's like if you punish somebody for theft, in part the punishment for theft is meant to discourage people from stealing again. Like, look, if you steal, you're going to get punished, so don't do it. So one purpose of punishment is restraint. The other purpose of punishment is reparation, which means, sort of getting damages. So if somebody steals a fish from you, you're entitled to get a fish back from them, probably plus a little bit. So by nature, every individual has the right to enforce the law of nature. The other thing, which I alluded to in the last time, is that Locke has a chapter on slavery, and Locke argues that human beings cannot consent to be slaves. Now, this argument about slavery, this is an important one in his context, because those who would defend the absolute right of kings would sometimes do so by saying, well, look, if a person can consent to be a slave, then they can consent to be ruled by an absolute sovereign, right? Because it's not necessarily that different. Both a slave master and an absolute sovereign have total power over you. So the argument was, look, if you can consent to be a slave, then you can consent to be ruled by an absolute king. And Locke cuts that argument off, you might say, at the root by saying, well, no, you can't consent to be a slave. Therefore, you can't consent to be ruled by an absolute monarch. You can't consent to be under the absolute authority of another human being. That's the point of the argument. It's the argument is basically this, that you have, under the law of nature, and this is in sections 22 and 23, under the law of nature, you have not just a right, but a duty to preserve yourself. And therefore, you cannot, it is not morally permissible for you to do things that unnecessarily jeopardize your own survival. Now, to be a slave is to be owned by somebody else, which is to say they have complete and arbitrary authority over you to use you as they wish, which includes killing you. Right? The real ownership of another person implies you have a right to force them to do whatever you want, and you have a right to kill them if you feel like it. And Locke argues that it is never consistent with the law of nature to subject yourself to the arbitrary authority of another fallible human being. since absolute power entails the right to destroy people. But remember, under the law of nature, we don't even have a right to destroy ourselves. Suicide is forbidden. You have a duty to preserve yourself. So you can't give somebody the right to destroy you. You can't say, you have the right to do with me whatever you will. You can't give somebody that right because you don't have it. You can't give what you don't have. And you don't have the right to destroy yourself. You don't have the right to just randomly harm yourself and things like that. You have a duty to preserve yourself. And because you have a duty to preserve yourself, you cannot consent to be enslaved because that's giving somebody else the right to destroy you, and you don't have that right to give. So I just wanted to mention those two things, the right to enforce the law of nature and that you can't consent to be a slave. And for Locke, that not consenting to be a slave is a very important argument because it goes to the root of his objection to absolute or arbitrary government. For Locke, because of the law of nature, arbitrary authority is never justified. Imperfect human beings can never be trusted with absolute power. Fallible, imperfect human beings can never have the right to treat other human beings arbitrarily. Now, there are always limits. You always have to respect the rights to life. And because you have to respect the right to life, you have a duty to respect the right to liberty, too. So you can't consent to be a slave. Now, this gets us to chapters 7 through 10. And these are the chapters that are concerned with the origin and purpose and some basics of government. So, first of all, he talks about civil society or political society. For instance, in sections 87 and 89. A political society or a civil society, that's Locke's term for a society of human beings who have voluntarily given up their natural liberty and agreed to live together under a common government. So a civil society is a society of human beings under a government, a human authority. And as you can see, in order to live under human authority, you have to give up your natural liberty. Your natural liberty says no human being's in charge of you. But living under government obviously entails that the government is in charge of you within certain limits. So in order to live under government, you've got to renounce that natural liberty. Okay. Now, the government of, and so civil society, again, is the name for a society of people under government. The other term that he uses for this is a commonwealth. Like a particular civil society is a commonwealth. He refers to that in, for example, section 133. And a commonwealth is just his name for an independent political community. Right? So he would call the United States of America a commonwealth. So the government of a commonwealth or of a civil society necessarily exercises a few powers. It exercises legislative power and executive power. That's in section 88. Legislative power meaning the power to make laws. One of the fundamental purposes of government is to make rules that everybody lives under. And then you have the executive power. And the executive power means the power to enforce the laws. Because in order for people to live under a common set of rules, it's not just enough for those rules to be made. The rules have to be enforced, right? Through law and through like legal systems, punishments, and things like that. Now, as he says in section 88 and in sections 145 and 146, the government also exercises a third power. And the third power here, he's not talking about the judicial. You might think, well, legislative, executive, and judicial power, right, if you've taken American politics before. But Locke doesn't talk much about the judicial power. The third necessary power of government, according to Locke, is what he calls the federative power. And the federative power means the power of the government to represent the country as a whole in its dealings with other countries. So the federative power means things like the right to make war, the right to make alliances, the right to engage in international trade, the right to engage in diplomatic relations. So the federative power refers to war, peace, foreign relations, diplomacy, and all that kind of stuff. Because obviously there are lots of political communities out there. So when a government tries to protect you, right, for the common good, it's got to protect you internally through law and order, so that citizens are not dangerous to one another. But you've also got to protect the community from outside aggression. So when you have a civil society, when you have a commonwealth, your government, the people in charge, necessarily exercise lawmaking, legislative, and law enforcing, executive powers, in addition to the federative power. Um, but as Locke says in section 87 and in section 95 and in section 119, because human beings are by nature free, not subject to human authority, governmental authority can only come about through human beings voluntarily renouncing their natural liberty and agreeing to live under a common authority. And this is, in the question, like, why is the consent of the governed important according to Locke? The reason why is because since we are free by nature, the only way we can be subject to human authority is by agreeing to do so. And we agree by, among other things, renouncing our natural liberty, saying, I renounce my natural liberty, and I agree to live under law. And so when you have a group of people who have done that, who have agreed, we all renounce our natural liberty and agree to live under a common authority, you've got your commonwealth. Now, Locke, kind of like Hobbes and others, argues that, there are many different potential forms of government that a commonwealth can have. And so Locke basically just says, like, when a commonwealth is formed, the majority decides what particular form of government will be adopted. That's sections 98 and 99. We don't need to go into that. But so just to say a little bit more about consent, remember, to join civil society, people must give up their natural liberty. And remember, natural liberty refers to your right to be your own master, subject only to the law of nature and not subject to other human beings. So when you join civil society, you give that up. And in return, you take on what Locke calls the freedom of man under government. Because being free under human authority is going to be different from natural liberty. Natural liberty is nobody's my boss. But Locke thinks that once you have government, you can still meaningfully talk about being free under government too. And the freedom of man under government, and this is section 22, Locke defines as being subject to a legislative authority, but one that derives its authority from the consent of the governed. So in other words, the lawmaking power that you're subject to has gotten that power from the consent of the people that it governs. So to be free under government means to be subject only to the legislative power that has gotten the consent of the people. And he says, in addition to that, as Hobbes said, anywhere where the law is silent, you have the freedom to do whatever you want. So much as in the state of nature, you have the right to do whatever you want so long as you don't break the law of nature. In civil society, it's a little bit more complicated. In civil society, you have the right to be your own master so long as you don't break the law of nature or the law of the land. Right? You can think of something like driving on the right side of the road. That's not a natural law. In some countries, people drive on the left, right? It's a human convention. But once you're in society, once the legislative authority makes a law saying everybody has to drive on the right side of the road, then that's that. As long as it's a legitimate legislative authority, you've got to follow those rules. So even though by nature you have the right to decide what side of the road you drive on, once legislation has been made, you've got to abide by that legislation. So for Locke, freedom of man under government means to be subject only to a legitimate legislative authority, the right to be your own master wherever the law is silent, and as is the case in the state of nature, the right not to be subject to the arbitrary will of other human beings. So that's section 22, sections 128 and 129. So the idea here is, remember, in the state of nature, everybody is equally subject to the law of nature and is otherwise their own master. In civil society, everybody's equally subject to the law of the land and their own master underneath that or within that. So in neither the state of nature nor in civil society is some human beings being subject to the arbitrary will of other human beings legitimate. No, it's always some kind of law, some kind of impartial law, either the law of nature or the law of the land. but you're never subject to the will of another. This is what John Adams talked about, that in America we have rule of law, not rule of the will of the ruler, but the rule of law. Everybody's subject to the same rules. So that's the kind of freedom that you get when you join a political society. And remember, since we are free by nature, the only way we can subject ourselves to human authority is by doing it ourselves. If somebody else tries to force us to be subject to human authority, that's aggression against us, and we have the right to fight back. I have a right to be my own master unless I give that up in exchange for joining society. So that's why the consent of the governed is so important. In the first place, consent of the governed doesn't refer to things like elections. It refers to consenting to be a member of a political society in the first place, and whatever constitution it happens to have. Now, but in order to join civil society, as Locke points out in section 128 and section 130, Locke also says in order to join civil society, it's not just that you have to give up your natural liberty in order to live under the law, but you also have to give up your right to enforce the law of nature. You can't be a vigilante in civil society. The whole point of civil society is that there are common rules that are enforced by the government. And that means you, for outside of cases of, like immediate self-defense, you do not have the right to go around being judge, jury, and executioner. That's for the public authorities now. So you transfer the right to punish, the right to execute the law of nature. You transfer that to the civil authority. But again, when it's a case of immediate self-defense, obviously the right to life means you have the right to preserve yourself. So the way I oftentimes think about it is, if somebody attacks you in an alleyway and there are no police around, nobody's around to protect you, of course you have a right to fight back and to try to save yourself. That's, that we all recognize that. But let's say somebody attacks you in an alleyway and they run away and they escape, but you know who they are. What Locke would say is, if you know who they are, you don't have the right to, say, track them down 2 weeks later and beat them up. Now, if somebody assaults you and then gets away, your duty is to report it to the police, and it's up to the public authorities to apprehend and to punish the person. So you can't go around being like, okay, that guy wronged me, 2 months from now, I'm going to ambush him when he's leaving his office. No, you can't do that. In the state of nature, you could do that. In an anarchic environment, if you decide that the best way to secure yourself is to let somebody who just attacked you run away and you'll track him down later and kill him, Locke would say you can do that in the state of nature. But in civil society, once it's no longer a case of immediate self-defense, it's your duty to hand over to the authorities the actual enforcement of the law. So that's sections 128 and 130. But all of this leads to a question. It's a question that he himself raises, which is, why would anybody want to leave the state of nature? The state of nature, as Locke presents it, sounds pretty good, right? I'm my own master. I can do whatever I want. I can acquire property for myself. I don't have to have a boss. I don't have to have a ruler. Why would people, if they are free by nature, want to subject themselves to human authority? And the argument that Locke gives, it's pretty straightforward. He says, look, even though you have a right to be free in the state of nature, the state of nature is in fact very insecure, and hence you probably won't be free. You might have a right to be free, but there are going to be a lot of people out there, and this is, as Hobbes would say the same, there are going to be a lot of people out there that aren't going to respect that right. So even though in principle the state of nature is a state of great freedom, what you will probably find in the state of nature is a lot of violence and insecurity and domination, the rule of the stronger. So even though the state of nature sounds nice, it doesn't actually work. Why doesn't it work? What's wrong with the state of nature that makes it so it doesn't work? Us, human beings, imperfect human beings. People are selfish. They are fallible. They are greedy, right? Just as Hobbes had said. So anarchy doesn't work because of human beings. We are too imperfect to live without some form of authority to suppress evil and aggression. That's his basic argument. So because people are bad, not everybody all the time, but enough people enough of the time to make everybody insecure, because people are bad, you need to create some kind of authority that gives you more security than you can get for yourself. And in particular, Locke argues that the state of nature is insecure because it's lacking three things. In the first place, even though there is a law of nature that's discoverable by reason, Locke argues that in the state of nature, there really is no commonly acknowledged law of conduct for all. Not everybody knows about the law of nature or cares about the law of nature. So, in the state of nature or in an anarchical environment, there aren't commonly acknowledged rules that everybody knows are there and that they should follow. But the problem is, even if there were, let's just assume, let's say everybody knew and accepted the law of nature, even if you had commonly accepted rules, that wouldn't actually be enough to make the state of nature a secure situation, because whenever some kind of conflict would come up, there's no impartial way to resolve it. There's no impartial, or as Locke calls it, indifferent judge that we can turn to. So let's say two people who both agree on the law of nature, have a dispute where one person says, "Hey, that guy harmed me unjustly," and the other guy says, "No, I didn't." How do you resolve that? Where do you go? Where do you go to resolve that? Well, in the state of nature, everybody's the judge in their own case. But that's not going to work because everybody's partial to themselves. You're partial to yourself, you're partial to your friends. In the state of nature, nobody's impartial. So even if you had commonly acknowledged rules, you could not get impartial adjudication of disputes. So there are no commonly acknowledged rules, there are no impartial judges. But let's say you could resolve that. Let's say there's some guy like Bob, and everybody just knows, hey, Bob is really impartial, right? So when we have a dispute, let's take it to Bob, and we know he's going to treat us fair. Even still, the state of nature would not be secure. Because even if you had commonly acknowledged rules and you had impartial adjudication, the state of nature is still missing a third thing, namely the reliable execution of the law of nature. So like in the state of nature, let's say Mike Tyson and I are in the state of nature, and he takes a fish from me. I could say, hey, that's against the law of nature. And he could say, yeah, you're right. Right? And Bob could say, yes, that's right. I impartially determined that Mike Tyson has wronged you. But then what happens? You turn to Mike Tyson and say, give me the fish back. And he says, no, I want to keep it. And you say, no, well, give it back to me. It's mine. And he says, make me. And at that point, you realize, I can't. He has wronged me, but I have no way to get redress for that wrong because he's more powerful than I am. I can't do it on my own. So you see, the state of nature, it's missing three things. It doesn't have commonly acknowledged rules. Even if there were commonly acknowledged rules, there is no impartial adjudication when there's a dispute. And even if you have commonly acknowledged rules and impartial adjudication, you do not have reliable enforcement. The stronger can get away with anything they have the power to do. So the state of nature doesn't work. We have these natural rights. We have a right to be free by nature, but those rights are insecure in the state of nature because of the lack of commonly acknowledged rules and reliable adjudication and enforcement. And so this is why Locke says in sections 123 and 124, and again in section 131, that the purpose of government, the reason why human authority develops, is to protect people's property. Now, he uses property here in the extended sense of the life, liberty, and estate, which is to say physical property of a person. The purpose of government is to protect the property of those under the government. Because your property in this broad sense of your rights to life, liberty, and property, these rights are insecure in the state of nature. The purpose of government is to make those natural rights secure through reliable lawmaking, adjudication, and execution of the law. So the purpose of government is, in the words of the Declaration of Independence, to secure our natural rights, to protect us in our right to life, to protect us in our right to liberty, to protect us in our right to property. So again, as the Declaration says, governments are instituted among men to secure their rights, not to promote virtue directly, not to save people's souls, right? The purpose of government is not that exalted for Locke. Government doesn't exist in order to make you virtuous. Government doesn't exist in order to save your soul. Government exists to protect you from suffering harm at the hands of other human beings. That's the primary purpose of government. But also, as the Declaration says, since people are by nature free, the only way a group of human beings or an institution can acquire the right to make and enforce laws is if it's given that power through the consent of the people it governs. Right? The people have to give up their natural liberty and submit themselves to government and accept civil or political liberty in its stead. So because we are free, government must be based on consent, and the purpose of the power of government is to secure our natural rights. And so that's the basic account of the origin and purpose of government. In the next lectures, I'll move on to a few things that Locke says about how the kind of the structure and limits of a good government. And then we'll basically be done with Locke's political philosophy.